The murder of George Floyd was a catalyst for global calls for racial equity and police reform, especially in the US. 1 year on, and activists are still waiting for major legislation to be passed. Corporations are also under increased pressure to spend more on projects that uplift African Americans and other minority groups facing discrimination. Paolo Montecillo reports.
It's been a year since Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd in Minneapolis. Those who knew the victim are still grieving.
We got your back.
And their pain is only amplified by the numerous deaths of African Americans at the hands of law enforcement officials.
Floyd was my man. He was but one man. And there are so many cases that we need to reopen, not only in this state, in this country, across the world. We all know that.
Over the past 12 months, police in the U.S. have killed more than 180 unarmed black men. That's according to research group Mapping Police Violence. U.S. President Joe Biden pledged to have a police reform bill passed in Congress by May the 25th, the anniversary of Floyd's death. But the White House has missed that deadline, leaving activists frustrated.
A year later, we are still pleading and begging for laws to change. This is the truth of what's going on in Minnesota. There's bodies in Minnesota.
The Senate must bring this act into being. They're going on adjournment. There's been on an adjournment on justice for too long. It's time for them to vote and make this law.
As policymakers negotiate in Washington, billionaire investor Robert Smith is urging business leaders to increase their support for racial equity. America's richest black man has called on companies to allocate 2% of their earnings to help minority communities. It's only right, he says, given corporate America's history.
There are some companies that, the derivation of what makes them exist today actually came from them, profiting from the transatlantic slave trade.
Streaming giant Netflix has made that 2% pledge. Tech firms such as Apple and Google have also raised their contributions to racial justice initiatives. And banks, including Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, have vowed to increase lending to black-owned businesses. Smith says these investments are long overdue and will help address the injustices African Americans have faced for generations. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Now let's go to Eugene Puryear in New York. He's an activist and national organizer of the Act Now to Stop War and End Racism coalition, ANSWER. Welcome to the show. Now, lawmakers have been working on these police reforms, and yet they're nowhere to be seen. What, in your opinion, is the holdup?
I think the real holdup that we see is the reality that most of the political class in America is not actually interested in addressing the real scope of the challenge as it concerns policing. I mean, there's a lot of lip service that's paid, but to address the issue of policing in a substantive way means a serious addressing of hundreds of years of how state security forces have been used in the United States as an institution for really the social control of Black America. And while it's easy to sort of speak out against that, to actually start to change it means to really address the hundreds of years of racism and the continued systemic role in issues like gentrification, continued poverty, and so on and so forth, where the police are essentially playing a role of containing the social contradictions of American society. So rather than address the root causes of not only police violence, but community violence that allegedly is why the police are there, they are willing to leave the status quo the same, because to change that means that the status quo in an economic sense, in a social sense, in a cultural sense, has to be addressed in a profound way. And that's not always politically popular.
Let's talk about those grassroots issues. What sort of reform do you think is needed to address those issues? And of course, do you see the political will to do that?
The most important thing is we have to address the social context of policing. Like, we have to reduce the scope of policing in the United States. I mean, everything has a cause for something. And we know, for instance, that there are non-police methods called violence interruption of addressing murders, homicides, serious problem in the United States that have very successful rates, as much as 70% reductions in shootings and murders in cities like Chicago, which have such a bad reputation. So investing in programs that address community violence ahead of time, addressing the broader issue of the huge amount of poverty that is in existence in so many of these terrible communities, that also creates a social context by which sometimes people don't feel safe and want more of the police. We have to start to look at the root causes of quote unquote crime in this country so that we can get ahead of the problem, so that we need fewer police officers, that we reduce the scope of policing, and we reduce the need to bring in outside forces to resolve social contradictions that don't need to be there in the first place. And some of that is easier said than done. You can have, as I said, non-police methods of dealing with homicide. You can have non-police forces that intervene on mental health issues. All of that are things that we can do right away. But many of the things are a lot more deeply rooted in the structure of this country. I mean, when you have 40% of Black Americans outside of the labor force, according to the labor force participation rate, and the need to create, millions upon millions of jobs, maybe 3 to 5 million jobs to address that, just that. Forget everyone else who's unemployed and needs a job. Then you have to address the issue that African Americans are disproportionately in low-wage jobs. How do you then raise the level there? You can see the intense challenges that really pose a problem for the current model of capitalist employment in the United States. And it's not the thing you can just snap your fingers to do. And it means that you have to really challenge the biggest corporations and the most influential people.
So, Eugene, on your point about the disparity in the labor force, when we hear about these kind of initiatives that Paolo mentioned in his report, do you think that makes a dent to the historic inequity?
I think in a way it makes a dent culturally, because it at least raises to the level of the broader conversation that racism has to be addressed. In terms of, fundamentals, I don't really know. I mean, certainly, I think what Mr. Smith was laying out there is relevant. I mean, any money that's spent, for instance, to increase lending to small Black businesses can make a difference in many communities where Black people do not have access to loans. Even people who have existing successful businesses struggle to get loans to expand their business. So I think these things can make small differences, but when the vast majority of Black Americans remain workers, remain employed mainly by the largest corporations, we have to ask ourselves, how is it that we can get, say, the Amazons of the world that are making a big deal right now about how they want to embrace Black Lives Matter to talk about how they make sure that their own workers can have a living wage, because the majority of Black workers in Alabama, for instance, where we just saw a union drive, are making, quite frankly, poverty wages when we look at what it actually takes to survive. So I think it can play a role. I think it can certainly play an important messaging role to raise the importance of the issue. But we really have to address structurally how it is that the vast majority of Black people have ended up and continue to be on the lowest rung of the income scale, regardless of the fact that almost all corporations are now speaking in the rhetoric of anti-racism.
So the solution perhaps is much wider than just police reform. Eugene Puryear, thank you so much for taking the time out to talk to us.